You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda from New York City.
And Prashant Parmaswaran from Washington, D.C.
Happy New Year, Prashant. Good to be with you in 2018.
Same to you.
Well, I figured we'd take this first podcast of the year, which, by the way, is our 150th episode. We've been doing this for a while now, and 4 years in February. Anyways, I thought we'd take this episode and do kind of what a lot of places have been doing and just kind of, talk a bit about our expectations for this year. The significance of 2018, I think, broadly speaking, in Asia, there are several big picture questions. Not the least, being what is going to happen on the Korean Peninsula after an incredibly tense year. How will the United States relationship develop with China? Speaking of the United States, how will the second year of the Trump administration's America First foreign policy look in Asia in 2018? The second year of an administration is generally when, normally you'd have, seen appointments filled out much earlier and at least everybody getting used to the ropes, so to speak. But the administration has finally filled out major Asia posts, or at least nominated people. Ambassador posts still remain open, but we're starting to see a something of a foreign policy bureaucracy take shape again. And also we'll talk a bit about, just regional issues. The situation in Southeast Asia after an important year defined by terrorism, shaky progress on the South China Sea disputes, and of course, we'll talk a bit about South Asia and general geopolitical issues in the region. So it's a lot of ground to cover. But I figured just for organizational purposes, we'd maybe use Asia's natural geography and sweep from east to west, roughly. So why don't we begin with the Korean Peninsula, which is kind of at the top of a lot of people's agenda. I don't think matters were helped too much by Donald Trump's tweet the day before we taped this podcast, talking about the size of his nuclear button and Kim Jong-un's nuclear button. Leaving aside the fact that nobody actually launches nuclear weapons with buttons, it raised the temperature at a time when Kim Jong-un presumably has been trying to bring things to a new place in 2018. The New Year's address, I think, Prashant, is maybe a good place to start. What was your reaction to what Kim Jong-un laid out in that address?
Yeah, I think you wrote a piece shortly after the address that sort of summarized the key points, which is first, obviously there was a lot of continued bluster about North Korea's growing capabilities, but I think the striking note in the address, which folks picked up on, was also there was that opening diplomatically with that he left open with South Korea and potentially the Winter Olympics, which we talked about in the previous podcast as well, as an opening for potential talks or some kind of engagement. So I think it's not surprising. I think a lot of us sort of saw this as Kim Jong-un sort of trying to pick off South Korea within the context of the alliance and the sort of his version of decoupling. But I think it was an interesting thing because the bigger picture, as you correctly mentioned in the intro, is when you have U.S. President Donald Trump talking about sizes of nuclear buttons and continued bluster on the U.S. side, that opening that Kim Jong-un leaves with respect to engagement and that diplomatic side, makes the U.S. look like less of a reasonable party in the room relative to North Korea. Obviously, I don't want to sort of, dramatize the situation. The North Koreans are currently out of step here when it comes to nuclear norms and peace and stability in the region. But, Trump's bluster kind of complicates the picture. And I think Kim Jong-un sort of understands that, there is some room for maneuvering here, and I think he's using that. And it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. I mean, obviously, this is just sort of an opening gambit, but that will be interesting to see in 2018.
Yeah, I mean, it appears that there is reciprocity to Kim's offer, and next Wednesday, representatives from both sides should meet at the Peace Village at Panmunjom in the DMZ to hopefully hash out some sort of agreement that would allow North Korean athletes, which by the way would just be two figure skaters, to participate in the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. But I think one of the things that's been really striking to me this week, as something of a longtime Korea watcher, is just that how familiar a lot of this is. I mean, this difficulties within the alliance, especially, have never been new, especially within the context of a liberal-minded pro-engagement party in Seoul, paired with a more hardline denuclearization first government in the United States. We saw this in the early 2000s with Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun in the Sunshine years when the South Koreans pursued engagement and inter-Korean rapprochement with Kim Jong-il. And we have something of that now. I mean, obviously, I don't want to overstate it because I think Moon Jae-in should be given some credit for acting actually quite pragmatically over the past year. I mean, he entered office in North Korea immediately, cranked the velocity up to 60. I mean, they just went wild. They showed off the Hwasong 12, the Hwasong 14 ICBM, and then the rest of the year was particularly crazy, I think, with the overflights of Japan and the Hwasong 15 eventually. So I think this is all quite familiar, and I wrote a column for South China Morning Post where I think I made I pointed out the kind of decoupling angle to this and why it is good to remain wary, but what you said about the Trump administration not recognizing the South Koreans' kind of agency in the situation, I think really reverberates. And actually, even beyond Trump, I actually thought that Nikki Haley's statement yesterday on January 2nd was a little short-sighted. I mean, she said that the U.S. would treat the talks as effectively illegitimate if they happened without North Korea agreeing to denuclearization preconditions, which I think, not only shows a lack of knowledge of just how previous inter-Korean talks have happened, but also just I think is frankly, damaging to the alliance in a different way. There has to be a give and take between Seoul and Washington on what kinds of issues can be reserved for the inter-Korean agenda and what other issues can be reserved for the broader regional question, where I think the denuclearization issue will just have to sit, just given the realities. I don't think that, and also just to talk about the flip side, the North Koreans, I think, they're going to be asking for quite a bit. They're probably going to ask Moon to go to the United States and ask for a cancellation or a significant reduction of the joint military exercises coming up. But I think they know deep down that there is a limit to that. So this is all, quite familiar. I don't think we should be expecting, any kind of major breakthrough, but I think any kind of move towards peace or not even peace, but just the appearance of calm and North Korean athletes participating in the Olympic Games, I think can be a very positive, soothing balm in a moment of intensely high tensions, especially after late 2017.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing is that, as we're seeing these diplomatic endeavors and potential outreach, we're also seeing, these somewhat arbitrary percentages sometimes increasing about the potential for accidental war or conflict to erupt. And I know, we've talked about this extensively in previous podcasts too, but, it is important to sort of remind listeners that even though the logic for, deliberate escalation and the outbreak of violence is something that doesn't make sense for both sides. I mean, the potential for miscalculation is there. And, serious people who know this issue very well, have been following it for a long time, are worried about this, and we shouldn't, sort of underestimate the potential for that to happen.
Absolutely, I think that's a good place to end our discussion on the Korean Peninsula. Moving a little bit further inland, I want to talk a bit about China. So 2018, I think, has been set up as the beginning of the era of Xi Jinping thought after the 19th Party Congress. We've been led to believe that Xi has emerged from the 19th Party, the first plenum of the 19th Party Congress, as an exceptionally powerful leader, the most powerful in modern China since Deng Xiaoping, and is destined to take China's foreign policy in a more assertive direction, both within the Belt and Road Initiative, but also with regard to the great power competition with the United States. So I wanted to ask you, what's your readout or expectation of the general direction of U.S.-China ties this year? Where do you think things are going there?
Yeah, I think it's hard to look at the relationship and kind of not be worried. I think the sort of drumbeat that we're seeing from the Trump administration is that there's going to be some kind of tougher approach towards China. I mean, it's important to emphasize, as we've done before, that this sort of tough approach towards China is something that people have been talking about for years, and also it's somewhat delayed from the Trump administration. The officials, when they were coming in, were saying that this was going to be adopted and then North Korea and some other related issues kind of delayed it. There was the initial sort of purported bromance between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. But there is sort of a feeling and a sense from the administration based on what they're saying, but also the kind of some of the personnel that they've adapted or thought about hiring in the administration, that we could see the worsening of U.S.-China tensions. But I think the key issue here will be, where do we see those tensions manifest themselves? I mean, is this just sort of some hardening of potential economic disputes and the Trump administration hitting out with some kind of trade measures? Or is this something that could also drag in security issues in the South China Sea, which we've talked about, or potentially other fronts as well, like Taiwan? And I think that's the perspective from the Trump administration. On the flip side, with Xi Jinping, we've been talking about, in 2017, the consolidation of his power and authority. And I think the question for 2018 will be, to what end is this consolidation for? I mean, with Xi Jinping solidifying his authority, is he going to use this to sort of consolidate some of his domestic authority, push through some economic reforms, which were tough to push through earlier? Or is he going to also react overseas in a more international sort of activist fashion on South China Sea and some other issues, now that his legitimacy has increased and his standing has increased within the country? And we don't have a clear sense of that, but I suspect that this is a sort of interaction which there will be a lot of movement going into 2018. I think people want to be reassured that the U.S.-China relationship, because it's the most important relationship in the world, so to speak, that there will be a case that reasonable heads will prevail. But I don't think that that can be assumed in this case.
Absolutely. I think, one of the most important questions this year and in coming years will be, what does Xi Jinping want, which is a surprisingly difficult question to answer. I mean, we have an idea of Chinese foreign policy priorities, and obviously we know that the Belt and Road Initiative, especially after the 19th Party Congress, has been elevated in its importance in just China's overall state policy. But when it comes to narrower questions, the South China Sea, the East China Sea, relations with Japan, relations with the United States, geopolitical competition in Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, a lot of those questions I think will be important to watch this year. And of course, there is the PLA modernization story I think will continue this year. We may see China make significant progress with its upcoming indigenous aircraft carriers, which is expected to have nuclear propulsion and electromagnetic catapults, eventually leading up to a carrier force of 6 by the early to mid 2020s. But the area for, I think, conflict between the U.S. and China really should not be underestimated. I mean, one thing we didn't talk about is the national security strategy document that the Trump administration released at the end of 2017, which really pointed out, both China and Russia, somewhat surprisingly, as revisionist powers that are directly threatening the United States. And, part of me is, not going to fall victim to taking that document too seriously, because obviously we know the president likely has not read it or does not necessarily believe a lot of what that document contained, but it at least tells us about how his advisors will view this arena. And a lot of foreign policy in this administration, I think, will continue to operate on autopilot without necessarily the input of the president, or at least just a rubber stamp from him or approval. Because, there is that curious dynamic, too, that I'm looking forward to seeing how it plays out. I mean, the personal rapport between Xi and Trump was surprisingly good in 2017. That was kind of a major theme throughout the year. If we'd been doing this podcast a year ago, we'd maybe be talking about Trump's, surprise phone call with Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen. But, now I think really anything could happen when it comes to that relationship. So it's certainly something to watch quite closely this year.
Right, absolutely.
So, moving a little bit further south before we get to Southeast Asia, I thought we could talk about, just maritime disputes broadly. I mean, the situation in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, the Western Pacific, sort of segues from the conversation about PLA modernization. But I think maybe a good place to talk is, begin our talk is freedom of navigation. In 2017, the Trump administration continued to pay lip service to the idea. We were both at the Shangri-La dialogue when Mattis made his impassioned defense of freedom of navigation. Trump's undelivered remarks at the East Asia Summit would have defended freedom of navigation. The administration devolved a degree of authority to Pacific Command to conduct operations with a higher tempo and frequency. I'm also told that there have been unpublicized freedom of navigation operations that we haven't heard about last year. So there may have been more than the four that were publicized. But broadly, I mean, the South China Sea just really seemed to drop off a cliff last year, or at least things seemed to go in China's favor broadly, right? You had the ASEAN China Code of Conduct watered down quite a bit, a fairly milquetoast affair without a binding provision. This was a draft framework. But what's your general expectation for state of affairs in Asia's maritime flashpoints?
Yeah, I mean, I think starting with the South China Sea in particular, I think 2017, you put it exactly right. I mean, the Chinese tried to very deliberately create this narrative that, all is well. I mean, we agreed to finally talk about a code of conduct and move towards that following the creation of the so-called draft framework. And part of that was brought about by what the Chinese were doing, but part of it was also due to the fact that the Philippines, following the election of President Rodrigo Duterte, also dropped the ball on the South China Sea, and it was chairing ASEAN last year as well. And so you did see a little bit of that Chinese narrative gaining steam, and I suspect the Chinese have been leaning very heavily on Singapore, which is assuming the ASEAN chair this year, to also follow kind of a similar line to continue this progress on the so-called code of conduct, and the Chinese trying to make other overtures to make sure that they try to delegitimize any kind of perceived external intervention by the United States, Japan, India, other countries. So I suspect you'll continue to see that dynamic in 2018. I think the interesting dynamic apart from China that goes on in the South China Sea, and also this concept of freedom of navigation, which you and I follow quite closely, is this sort of quad or quadrilateral, and how other countries can either separately or jointly try to resist or possibly react to instances of potential Chinese aggression. I mean, the Chinese island building activity in the South China Sea was something that we talked a lot about before. But the trend of militarization that the Chinese have been pushing on the South China Sea hasn't gone away. And in fact, there was a lot of fears that that could actually accelerate in 2018 now that Xi Jinping has consolidated domestic power in China. And if that happens, things could get quite rough there if we see a potential reaction either from the claimant states or the United States or other actors as well. So I suspect that's kind of where a lot of the action will be in terms of concerns and worries. On the East China Sea, that's the other thing that's kind of an interesting dynamic, because you have this continued dynamic where Chinese presence and activities, and when it increases in certain areas or spheres, sometimes it tends to decrease in other spheres. But with Japan and China in the East China Sea, has continued dynamic of Japan continuing to be concerned about what the Chinese are doing, and both sides continuing to explore these, ideas of, crisis management hotline, potential negotiation like that. I don't really see, but views in 2018.
Absolutely. I think you summed up actually most everything that I was going to hit on. I think the Quad and the Indo-Pacific concept will be a big question to watch. It could be a bust this year. It could have been overly hyped in late 2017, or it could really turn into something. I mean, the Malabar exercise we talked about last year, I think there's a good chance it might be quadrilateralized in the upcoming year. Well, not formally quadrilateralized, but Australia can be invited to participate as the fourth participant, with India's enthusiastic acquiescence this year, especially after the Doklam dispute last year. I think India is taking quite a different tack on how it responds to Chinese sensitivities on a range of issues. But yeah, I don't think I have anything else to really add on that front.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Malabar as well, because I think the other sort of, I mean, we're going to move to South Asia, I know, and talk about that conversation separately. But within the maritime space, I think, India's conception of the Indian Ocean and its periphery and what the Chinese are doing in the Indian Ocean and in South Asia is another interesting dimension to watch as Modi develops his own foreign policy. I mean, India's outreach to ASEAN and Southeast Asia continues, but I do think that Indian Ocean dynamic will be interesting to watch as well, apart from South China Sea and East China Sea.
Yeah, absolutely, and we can talk a bit more about that in the in the South Asia context. Real quick, do you want to talk a bit about Southeast Asian outlook. And I know, that's a lot of countries to talk about, but I mean, there's a lot going on. Democratic regression in Cambodia, cautious democratic, I guess, moments of progress in the future in Thailand. Duterte continues on trilateral coordination in the Sulu SECs, Singapore's chairmanship, which you hit on a little bit. What's there to expect in Southeast Asia this year?
Yeah, I think you hit some of the key notes there. I think the big one is democratic regression or perceived democratic regression, alongside this idea that strongmen in Southeast Asia are kind of getting their way. And I guess the two biggest illustrations of that is Duterte's election and his subsequent progress in the Philippines in terms of consolidating his domestic power, and also Hun Sen in Cambodia, and the crackdown we've seen in Cambodia with respect to human rights and democracy. I think there's going to be sort of continued concern about some of the elections that we're going to see this year. You've got national elections in Malaysia and Cambodia. Thailand potentially, we're as
Yeah.
usual not really sure whether it's actually going to be held or not. And then you have local elections leading up to presidential elections in Indonesia in 2019. So some key elections going on, but the theme throughout, whether it's with Najib in Malaysia or Hun Sen in Cambodia, or with respect to Prayut and the military regime in Thailand, will be to what extent are we going to see rollbacks in terms of democratic progress, or more regression, or whether we'll actually see some transitions in favor of the opposition. And I think the latter scenario is at on the surface the more hopeful scenario, but it's also one which is more uncertain. I mean, if we do see an outcome in the Cambodian election where it's more contested and we see protests in the street, I mean, there is a potential for violence there. Similarly, in Malaysia, I mean, the sense is that Najib will do quite well and win the election easily. But if there's potential violence out there, that could be another source of concern. I think the other big thing in Southeast Asia to watch for is this notion of identity politics or extremism, take your pick of phrase or word, is gaining traction in the region. Whether you look at Indonesia and the sense that Islam is being used by extremist and radical voices to kind of forge a narrative that goes against what President Jokowi Widodo is trying to do in the country with respect to domestic reform. And then in Myanmar, where you're seeing, sort of this notion of, broadly speaking, Buddhist nationalism at the expense of the minority Muslim Rohingya, which we've talked about on this podcast before. I think that's the other big thing. I think that I'm glad you brought up the sort of trilateral patrols in the Sulawesi Sea. That's I think another interesting trend where we see Singapore is having the ASEAN chairmanship this year, and the Singaporeans have, true to form, lined up a series of regional initiatives that they'll look to make progress on. So there will be some things that happen on the regional front, but on the sub-regional front, there are some interesting things to watch too. I mean, the Sulawesi Sea patrols in the maritime space is one, but also, with respect to the Mekong countries, which is where China comes in and some of its economic progress that it's making with Southeast Asian states. That sub-regional component, I suspect, is going to be an important space to watch for 2018.
Absolutely, Prashant. And I think, just one final note to hit on the terrorism point is that I think the experience of the Marawi siege in 2017 will have been instructive. We observed a few intelligence failures in the early days of the siege, especially about foreign fighters. And Southeast Asian countries have and still remain concerned about returning fighters from the Islamic State's Middle East Caliphate, which remains in tatters today after a successful campaign to expunge Western Iraq and Eastern Syria of their presence. So I think that's, again, going to be something to watch for closely. Mm-hmm. So I think we can close out our discussion of trends to watch with South Asia, which is obviously a large region to take on in a short amount of time. But I want to kind of peg our conversation here to obviously nothing else but a tweet by Donald Trump. I believe it was maybe his first foreign policy tweet in 2018, where he lashed out at Pakistan. And we've seen him lash out at Pakistan before. He did it in his August address on Afghanistan strategy. But this was exceptionally strong language from him, condemning Pakistan for hosting America's enemies and terrorists and giving them safe haven. These complaints are old, but I think it was jarring to hear it from an American president like this. We're still waiting for confirmation that the United States is going to probably withhold payment of a $255 million tranche of foreign military financing, and it looks like U.S. Pakistan relations are set for a rocky period. And obviously, this has all been met with quite a bit of enthusiasm in New Delhi, where I think the foreign military financing cut is already being reported as fact, even though the White House still has to confirm it. But it's probably going to happen. But a lot's going on in South Asia, right? I mean, India-Pakistan relations remain rocky.
Hmm.
You talked a bit about the Indian Ocean milieu. Sri Lanka's transfer of the Hambantota port to China was completed in late 2017. Indian strategists remain concerned about China's Indian Ocean presence, especially with the Djibouti base now operationalized and Chinese forays into the Maldives and Sri Lanka. Nepal just had its a very significant election at the end of 2017, and politics there remain rocky. It remains to be seen if KP Oli will lead Nepal in a more balanced fashion this time around, or if he'll hew to his old ways as a explicitly pro-China president. So there's a lot going on. I mean, I just want to hit on some of those issues, but we can maybe focus a bit on the Pakistan angle. So what do you make of that Trump tweet? I mean, where do you think U.S.-Pakistan relations might go this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think you summed it up right, which is that these are not new complaints. With respect to U.S. Pakistan policy, there's been a lot of discontent in the United States, particularly on Capitol Hill, on in terms of what the Pakistanis have been doing. But it's sort of this continued trend. If you look at U.S. Pakistan relations more broadly, historically speaking, where it's the United States turning to Pakistan when it needs assistance in its Middle East, South Asia broader policy, but then sometimes being dissatisfied at Pakistan's sort of perceived double game when it comes to how it deals with the United States, but also tries to protect its own interests, which don't necessarily converge entirely with what the United States is doing. So, not surprising, but the way in which Trump is doing this, which is through Twitter as opposed to through policy statements, is the thing that's the most striking. And I think whether it's Pakistan or North Korea policy, the continued trend we're seeing is whenever Trump takes a sort of position that differs remarkably or in terms of the conduct in which it's being conducted, I think people say, well, maybe this could be for the better. I mean, he's shaking things up. Maybe he could get things done, and a lot of these people shared those views that he's articulating. But I think that has very clear downsides in terms of the confusion and potential chaos that it creates. And it's not clear that that has a particular upside. It's one thing if the United States was clearly taking a strategic, sort of rethinking of its South Asia and its Middle East strategy, with Trump sort of leading that charge. But I don't sense that that's something that's actually going on. I think there's sort of a almost ambivalence among the foreign policy elite in terms of saying, oh, maybe Trump actually means it, maybe he doesn't, and he's just kind of letting off some steam and then moving on to the next hot button foreign policy issue of the day. And I don't sense that this is a trend that's going to go away with respect to how he deals with it. I think the other thing, quickly, just to touch on what you mentioned, I know you follow this very closely, the Doklam dispute and India-China relations in 2018, I think is another interesting relationship, which, we'll have to see how that plays out. But certainly, 2017 was a year where, there were a lot of potential problem areas. And as we're looking for some of these bigger indicators, whether it's on Doklam or One Belt, One Road, or even the U.S. policy towards the region, I think that's one big relationship which I think will continue to sort of make the headlines for 2018.
For sure. No, totally Totally behind you on that. Especially India just appointed a new foreign secretary who was actually the ambassador in Beijing during the Doklam dispute and took a very forceful position on that.
Hmm.
And I think we're seeing, India take a very kind of a pragmatic and forward-looking position on its relationship with China. That's, that old formula of cooperation and competition, I think, still exists. It hasn't been eroded entirely by Doklam. Doklam, I think, was a huge blow to trust, and obviously I think caused quite a bit of damage to the perceptions of China and Indian public opinion. But this relationship will certainly be one to watch. There's actually a standoff ongoing right now in Arunachal Pradesh that I think might, again, we might see that spiral out of control. It's difficult to tell. In the early days of the Doklam dispute, it appeared it might end quickly, but it ended up dragging on. It still goes on. There's still troops there. We just don't hear about it as much because they've retreated a little bit and they're not doing much. They're just sitting there holding their positions, laying claim to that territory. So that border continues to remain one of great interest, and we'll be following that at the Diplomat, obviously, this year. On Pakistan, I think... yeah, I mean, everything you said, I think, is bang on. I mean, we've seen this before. Is this the administration to make good on threats to Pakistan? A lot of people think yes. A lot of people are more skeptical, especially when the Trump administration wants to increase its presence in Afghanistan, which it appears to be sustaining. How's that going to work if Pakistan closes off supply lines? I have no clue. And will the United States, start conducting more unilateral drone operations, covert operations against terror targets in Pakistan's tribal areas without necessarily Pakistani acquiescence? That could lead to Pakistan taking action. I mean, there's all these contingencies that I feel like haven't been thought through strategically right now. I think there's a general, Trump has probably been briefed about U.S.-Pakistan relations, and his gut reaction was unhappiness, and he tweeted it out. But this has been, a long-standing problem in U.S.-Pakistan relationship, is that the two countries find it very difficult to formally break up, and it leads to a lot of resentment, a lot of trouble seeing eye to eye. But I think what's interesting here is the Indian angle. I mean, I feel like in Trump's first year, India has been among the Asian countries that has really had a good instinct for how to make the most of this administration. I mean, everything, from the popularization of the Indo-Pacific concept to the return of the quadrilateral, I think a lot of that did have to do with kind of deft diplomacy from both India and Japan. So I think, we'll see how U.S.-India relations also develop this year. Yeah, this is going to be quite an exciting year in Asia, I think. It's never a dull year in Asia. I mean, let's put it that way. But 2018, I think, promises to crystallize a lot of trends that we've been watching for a long time, and obviously, we're looking forward to the inevitable curveballs. Obviously, hopefully, nothing as bad as what we witnessed last year. I'm hoping there will be less activity out of North Korea when it comes to ballistic missile testing, although not expecting to really get that wish granted. Obviously, hoping for nothing like the surprising at the time Marawi city siege at the end of May, which was a terrible tragedy, and I think Southeast Asian countries will be looking to avoid that at any cost. And generally, I think there remains a lot of room for geopolitical tension in this region. So I think that sums it up for today, Prashant. What do you think?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a good note to end on. I think a lot of potential challenges, but also, lots of potential opportunities as well.
Great. Well, thanks a lot for listening to this episode. Like I said, this is our 150th episode for the podcast. So if you've been listening since episode 1, thanks a lot for supporting the show and keeping with us all this way. I know we messed up the schedule a bit in the final days of 2017 due to the holidays and some travel, but we'll try to bring things back to a regular schedule in 2018. That is my promise to you. So thanks a lot for listening. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet so you don't miss future episodes. And if you have but you haven't left us a rating yet, please do so. It really helps get the word out about the show. Thanks for listening.